Hello and welcome to Future Squared. Stephen Hawking once said that intelligence is the ability to adapt to change, so let's adapt. My name is Steve Goveski, and each week I'll bring you conversations with preeminent thought leaders from a variety of fields to help you think in a multidisciplinary way, kick goals in your professional and personal life, and better navigate what is fast becoming a brave, new world. Future Squared is brought to you by Collective Campus, an innovation accelerator that works with organizations to unlock their people's latent potential to create more impact for humanity and lead more fulfilling lives. If you need help driving your organization's innovation strategy, visit collectivecampus.io. And without further ado,
come with me if you want to live.
A non-disclosure agreement could be a dozen pages and take teams back and forth with your customer or your supplier weeks. You know, we said, no, can you get that down to a page? Can you cut your cycle time and approvals down from weeks to a day? And that then moves the process faster. What were the digital tools that we could get? The approvals that did you really need those approvals? So we were able to challenge everything and get that feedback. So you have to look at the whole process, and the culture had to value speed. And the most important thing, I think, and speed was critical, but the feedback loops. You mentioned it, that ongoing feedback from one another and from the outside world. How am I doing?
welcome back to Future Squared for episode number 320 with Beth Comstock. Beth Comstock is a changemaker who has helped people grapple with rapid-fire change and open up their companies to transformation. Before she ever led the reinvention of a team or business, she learned to rely on her curiosity to provoke change in herself. She infused her life with the habit of discovery, seeking out new ideas, people, and places, and in turn, she built a career path from storyteller to chief marketer to GE vice chair and now author. Beth knows what it's like to work on the front lines of change. In nearly 3 decades at GE, she led efforts to accelerate new growth and innovation, initiated GE's digital and clean energy transformation, developed new businesses, and increased GE's brand value. She helped to create GE Ventures, oversaw GE Lighting, and was the company's chief marketing officer. As president of integrated media at NBC Universal, Beth oversaw ad revenue and the company's digital efforts, including the early development of Who.com. Earlier in her career, she held a succession of marketing and communication roles at GE, NBC, CBS and Turner Broadcasting /CNN. Comstock is also a director at Nike, trustee of the National Geographic Society, and former board president of the Cooper Hewitt Smithsonian National Design Museum. Most recently, Beth authored Imagine It Forward: Courage, Creativity, and the Power of Change, which forms the basis of our conversation. We touched on many a topic in this conversation, including one, how Comstock went about shifting the culture from seeking perfection before releasing anything to the public to one that embraced the concept of a minimum viable product. 2, the roadblocks she faced in rolling out the FastWorks program and the Lean Startup methodology across GE insofar as policy and procedure was concerned, and how to overcome this. And 3, what really happened when she and longtime CEO Jeff Immelt resigned from the company on the back of activist investors pushing for change, and why she thought it happened. So with that, enjoy my conversation with someone whose work I have referred to on numerous occasions in the past, the one and only Beth Comstock. Welcome to the show, Beth.
Great. Thanks for having me, Steve. Nice to be here.
It's an absolute pleasure to have you on the show, and you're joining me all the way from New York City, but I understand you're on your way to India this weekend.
I am. I'm off to do a little book tour and a lot of vacation and wander around. It's such an amazing country where there's so much color and everyone kind of lives it out loud. And I really enjoy India. Yeah,
the place definitely has a lot of energy. And speaking of the book tour, so you do have a new book out, or it is your first book. It's called Imagine It Forward: Courage, Creativity, and the Power of Change. And look, it's a loaded question to start with, but this will give us an opportunity to go in all sorts of directions. Why is confronting change so challenging organizationally, Beth?
Well, I wrote a book on it. There are so many reasons. I think mostly we think we have more time. And one of the things I start with the book is just the pace of the world will never be slower than it is right now. We're all kind of reeling from the dramatic pace, the disruptive nature of change. So I think generally organizations think they have time. Also, people don't like change. I don't like change. I call myself a change maker, but I don't like change. I don't like change that I don't control, which is a lot of it. So especially when change is happening to you, you don't like it. You want to hope it goes away. You tend to underestimate it. And I think thirdly, there's just a lot of fear. There's a fear about the unknown. We don't talk about fear at work often because we put on our game faces at work. We got to get in there. But often there's fear. We don't know how things are going to work out. What if the new order, I'm not as good at the new order as I was the way things were. And, we like what we know. So it's a host of those things. But those are, from what my experience, those tend to be the top things I've experienced.
Yeah. So thinking we have time, fear, and a sense of not being in control. On time, I think that's something that I've observed having spent almost a decade in the corporate world and now about 5 years in the entrepreneurial space, whereby in the entrepreneurial space, you have very limited runway, very limited time. You're always looking for product market fit in the early stages, at least. So you're trying lots of different things, whereby if you feel like, hey, we've got money coming in, we're growing, we've got lots of time, we don't need to worry about these things, perhaps it's easier to become complacent.
Yeah, I think that's absolutely right. And I think the entrepreneurial approach is one I would recommend for any size organization, that idea of kind of testing and learning. And you're working through things and giving yourself space for a bit more of a patient approach. So there's not such the panic. So in some ways you're operating your organization on different speeds, if you will. But yeah, I think that's exactly it. You get a bit complacent. You think, hey, things are good now. And you can't run an organization totally in panic and fear and paranoia. But I think a bit of healthy paranoia, a bit of asking ourselves, even measuring in your team how quick you are to respond to customers, how quick you are to respond to simulations or risk assessment. Those kinds of things are ways to start to build up some of those muscles.
Yeah, definitely. And I think just tightening that feedback loop, something John Boyd, the military strategist, talked about, the OODA loop: observe, orient, decide, and act. And the faster you can do that, the faster you can learn and figure out what's actually worth doubling down on. But while you were at GE, you were there for 27 years and you helped initiate GE's digital and clean energy transformation. You developed new businesses and increased GE's brand value, essentially. You were behind things like GE Ventures, GE Lighting. Despite all of that, what were some of the roadblocks you encountered in getting some of these things off the ground to begin with?
Well, I think the first thing is just being able to spot a trend or see change early. I think it became I made it my job. I had to form myself. I grew up in the organization as a marketer, and we had to redefine what marketing meant. It was about living in the market. Most people think marketing in business is what you do at the end. It's the story you tell, the ad. For the work I was joining, the teams I worked with, we were putting a stake in the ground to say, no, marketing's what you do at the beginning. It's where's the market going? And when you live in the market, you have to get out in the organization. You see where change is happening. So I'd say that became my job, to understand where change was happening. So I had to become a translator. I call it being an outsider inside. I had to constantly be outside foraging, if you will, for what's next and what's new. And then have enough of the cultural sense and the language skills to bring it back and work with other people to translate it in ways that people could understand what I was talking about. And more importantly, so that they could see it for themselves too. So I think that was one of the things I had to learn how to do. One, get out in the world, see change, meet it early, and then work to make it relevant and translate it in ways that your colleagues can understand it. Now, I can give you an example if you want.
Yeah, I think that translation piece, yes.
Yeah, I mean, take something like, I'll just say, take driverless cars when that first came onto the scene. If you're in a company like the company I was in, GE, we didn't make cars. So at first I come back, driverless cars, it's a real thing. We need to look at it. We need to talk about it. Well, the reaction is, yeah, but we don't make cars. So, let General Motors worry about that. That's not our problem. And so you have to get more comfortable with it, and you have to keep talking about it. And people are like, we told you that's not of interest to us. And you go, well, wait a minute. This is about transportation. It's about robotics. It's about driverless everything. Driverless planes. We make jet engines. It's about driverless trains. We make those. It's about how we think about data and information. And so you have to get it familiar enough, and then people have to go and see it, and they have to see what it means for them and what it means to be in a driverless car experience. So a lot of then what I had to do was kind of organize field trips where we would take teams of people to have experiences so they could start to go, I see. You're right. Wow. If we do this with a train, how might that change the whole dynamics of the rail business? So partly you're trying to create this surround sound of change, and not every trend you see is going to be relevant, but you're spending enough time understanding it. And we would do that with clean tech, with new models of manufacturing, and on and on. So you need kind of an advanced team, a series of scouts. That's what I was in a lot of. And then people had to go see it for themselves. It wasn't enough for me to just say, hey, look what I found. They had to see it to understand it themselves.
And it sounds to me like there was quite a bit of critical thinking in the sense of, hey, here are the trends, but here are the ways they may apply to our existing value chain. Here are the ways they may apply to our value chain in the future, rather than just downloading some report on what people want right now. It's about how might this affect our business in 5 years' time, and how might we get ahead of that growth curve?
Yeah. And I named my book Imagine It Forward because that's part of the exercise you're doing in these situations. You're working with your colleagues to say, let's imagine this forward. Okay, it's cars today. Where might this go in the future? Another example was the clean tech and the renewable energy revolution in industry that we saw early. And it's not that people didn't see it. They just didn't believe it would ever be big enough. And they didn't hear their customers asking for wind or solar. So one of the things we had to do in that case was actually do discovery sessions with our customers. We had to bring in customers and together look at the trends and do dreaming sessions to say, what if? Peer out 10 years from now. And we'd give them virtual currency, virtual investment dollars of ours. If we gave you $1 million, would you invest it in wind or solar or storage? And so that got the internal team more comfortable when they were side by side with customers together, seeing how that could become real and making bets on timing. So that was also I'd say a great learning to try to do that with your customers as well as just with your colleagues.
Yeah, that makes a hell of a lot of sense. And something that comes to mind is just, if I'm a large commercial real estate company and I need to think about origination of assets, I might play it forward and think, well, if self-driving cars really become a thing in 10 years' time, maybe there will be less need for big old parking lots. And we've got all these parking lots, so what can we do with them? Maybe there'll be more need for urban farming and things of that persuasion. But it really is about identifying what are the potential scenarios that may come to be, and then place bets on the likelihood of that and run experiments along that way.
That's exactly right, Steve. That's exactly what you have to do. And I'm big on making scenario planning a kind of a practice, part of what you do at work. You're not going to predict the future by doing these, but you are doing what you're talking about. You're kind of flexing that imagination muscle. You're saying, some of the, what's the worst that could happen? Is there an idea that comes out of this? Okay, let's just imagine we are producing, that driverless cars do happen. What, from a real estate perspective, as you said, would happen. There's nothing wrong in engaging in these exercises to start to think about new ideas, to see what would you do. What if the problem we're trying to solve is not the problem at all? That's a good question. This idea of of just constantly having a mechanism where you're testing your assumptions with new insights. And scenarios, I think, help you do that quite well.
Yeah, definitely. And on our marketing being something you do at the beginning, that's obviously quite resonant of the lean startup methodology, whereby you figure out what customers actually want, you define those problems, those solutions, the customer segments, you go out and you test and you develop the product from there and marketing with that. Now, I know GE has been held up as a poster child, or was held up as a poster child, for being a massive proponent of the lean startup. You guys worked with Eric Ries, who trained thousands, if I'm not mistaken, or at least 1,000 middle managers on the lean startup philosophy with the FastWorks program. How much of a shift was it for an organization that was so consumed with Lean Six Sigma to adopt the lean startup?
Yeah, it's a good question. I mean, I always used to joke with Eric, he, as a startup person, he adopted lean methodology out of manufacturing, and we needed an entrepreneur to bring it back to us into GE. Yeah. And I think the idea of lean manufacturing, it's really about agility and doing things with a bit of constraint and speed. And so that resonated. What was a new concept out of lean startup was this notion of a minimally viable product. And that really took off in our company. I will say, though, at first, some of my colleagues, especially some of the engineer and product folks in something like aviation, would be like, I don't like the idea of a minimally viable jet engine. And you're like, well, no, we're not talking about that. We're talking about a new business or a new product that you would start small before you get it to full scale. But this idea of a minimally viable product as something you would test with a customer early. And even in aviation, you could go with an energy saving app. You could go with a new digital service. There are a lot of things you could take to customers before they were perfectly engineered to say, give me feedback earlier. Let's test this together. It puts you on a path of test and learn, so that what happens is you're getting ongoing feedback, to your earlier point of feedback loops. You're investing money along the way at a sort of more reasonable rate. What often happens in big companies is we throw too much money at the wrong stage. So with this method, you're testing and learning, and you're allocating your capital, I think, much more efficiently. And your customer, I mean, not every customer is going to do this with you, but your really kind of partnership customers feel like they're part of the product development cycle. So they're much more likely to be invested in the product because they feel like they helped develop it. So all those things really got kicked off with some of the lean startup methodology for us.
Yeah, and I think it's worth stressing that this was being applied to things like engine turbines, like healthcare C-arm devices, because something I often hear from executives is, yeah, but we're in a regulated industry. We deal with people. We can't build minimum viable products because we are risking people's lives potentially. But it's not about that. And I think in the case of the C-arm devices, what GE did, and correct me if I'm wrong, was develop prototypes that it was essentially able to pre-sell to customers based on that early feedback, based on nothing more than low fidelity prototypes.
Yeah, exactly. And it was just getting the feedback, because what often happens, especially in technology companies, and everybody means well, but you want the product to be absolutely perfect before you roll it out, and you roll it out at scale. And what often happens is it's over-engineered. It becomes more expensive than the customer wanted, and maybe too many features. I always like to think of the remote on your television set. I mean, you have all these buttons, and how many of them do you actually use, or do you find value? And it's like it can become that way in technology companies too. But if you can work with your customers in an ongoing process, you're able to understand much earlier what they value, what they're willing to pay for. And again, I think that's the role of marketing in these cases, is to help navigate that and to get to the heart of those the pain points, the needs, all these words we talk about, but they're real issues in business.
Definitely. And on that remote control with 100 buttons, but you're only really using 10 or 20, I mean, that's the whole 80-20 Pareto principle. But when it comes to trying to keep things simple within the context of an organization like a GE, where for so long we default to meetings and outsourcing accountability to steering committees and things of that persuasion. And what that does is you just have a lot of decision makers adding complexity to a product, delaying the delivery timeline, increasing cost. How do you delicately sort of balance that culture with the fact that with minimum viable product, you're essentially looking to build the most simple version of a product, not the 100-button remote control?
Yeah, and that's exactly it. I mean, you're valuing speed, you're valuing feedback, you're valuing how quick you can get a product into market. I mean, the things we started to measure, we took lean startup and turned it into more of an effort we called fast works. It was as much about speed as it was more customer focused development. But we were able to reduce that bureaucracy just because people became impatient with, why do I need to have all these approvals? Why am we were trying to push the decision making closer to the use case, to the customer. And doing that kind of test and learn, that creating that feedback loop faster allows you to do that. So you're not waiting a year to get feedback from your customer. You're doing it in maybe 90 days, maybe 6 weeks, and you're saving time, money, and you're getting the product out faster. And when people started to see that, we'd actually make kind of heroes out of the case studies of people who would go from maybe a product took 18 months and they were able to do it in 6 months at 40% of the cost. Those teams became heroes because they were able to just be much more effective and to innovate more.
Yeah, and I did read a number of case studies whereby products in GE's industrial division managed to decrease time to market validation by something like 80%, which just frees up time to test 5 times as many things, essentially.
And that was part of the challenge in established companies. What often happens is you're assigned you have a budget process. People don't want to give back their budget. They don't want to say things aren't working. Just all these things slow you down. With this sort of lean startup mindset where you're trying to move fast and get feedback and spend the least amount possible, you realize that the quicker you can get to the no, the faster you get to a yes, and you can do more with your money. So you have room for more ideas, more products. Where people used to hoard and protect and not want anyone to, sort of give them any feedback, it totally changes the dynamics when they realize they can get more out of it, and they can invent more, they can make more product. That liberates teams.
And on successfully implementing the lean startup, something I'm seeing a lot of organizations do is focus a lot on capability building, but neglect the culture, the values, the policies, the procedures. So if I'm trying to implement lean startup, but every idea needs to go through a 20-page business case that goes up for approval, that's really not going to help things. But I understand at GE, you were fundamental in transitioning or shifting some of those key cultures and values.
We were trying to. I mean, and it had to impact every part of the business. So we started with some of the most difficult challenges. It wasn't just product. It was also working with legal or supply chain. Take legal, a non-disclosure agreement could be, a dozen pages and take teams back and forth with your customer or your supplier weeks. We said, no, can you get that down to a page? Can you cut your cycle time and approvals down from weeks to a day? And that then moves the process faster. What were the digital tools that we could get? The approvals that did you really need those approvals? So we were able to challenge everything and get that feedback. So you have to look at the whole process, and the culture had to value speed. And the most important thing, I think, speed was critical, but the feedback loops. You mentioned it, that ongoing feedback from one another and from the outside world. How am I doing? Is this fast enough? Am I getting traction? So I think feedback was a big learning for me personally, and I think for our culture. And feedback means you have to be able to say that idea doesn't work. The customer doesn't like it. Our competitors are actually better at that. And often in companies, we don't want to hear some of the bad news. And so we kind of avoid it. Yeah,
definitely. It's like that story of the manager who gave their staff the hairdryer treatment every time somebody came along with bad news. And sure enough, after a while, they stop hearing the bad news because nobody wants to be on the receiving end of an angry manager. But it's not because there's none to report. So feedback is definitely something we can learn from and apply and get better with. But on identifying a lot of those roadblocks, Beth, for example, your non-disclosure agreements, your long-winded business cases and things of that persuasion, was there an intentional sort of effort to identify all of the roadblocks, or was this something that came out organically over a, say, period of months or years?
Well, it was a little both. I mean, I think there was some quite organic. People had one of the biggest things I've learned in the course of a career is, you can only tell people to change so much. People have to see that it matters to them. One, there's incentives, of course, but they have to see that it's going to make their work better, that they actually have the freedom to do it. So you have to allow a certain amount of room for people to go, oh, this actually works in my case. I remember in the early days when we started Lean Startup, the hardware guys were like, well, wait a minute, this is a software process. You don't know how hard hardware is, they would say to Eric Ries. And then about 18 months in, I remember one of them raised his hand in one of our sessions and said, I get how this works in hardware, but I'm not sure it's going to work in software. And Eric and I were like, okay, we got it. This is taken off. But they had to find their way there. And they had to be coached. And so there's a part where you're going fast and there's a part where you have to allow time for people to make it their own. And there's tension in that, right? You can't mandate it, but you have to work toward deadlines and goals, and top leadership always wants it to go faster. There are always people who want to hold out and slow it down. And, that's part of the tension of it. It rarely, it's always messy, and it's rarely, it's not fun. So, but that's part of the learning of it.
Yeah, it's definitely worth calling out that it's always messy and not fun. And you've got to lean into the adversity that comes with trying to change the way people have always done things. But for some of the executives listening to this who might be embarking on their own sort of lean startup journeys, from day one, when there was the initial seed of the idea to start experimenting with faster feedback loops, with a lean startup, setting up the FastWorks program, to a point where you could actually successfully implement lean startup without coming up against all sorts of roadblocks. I mean, how long did it take to make those shifts?
It took, I'd say, a good year to get the sort of the early adopters doing it and being role models and people wanting to follow them. It took about 18 months, I think, for people to start to go, okay, at a larger scale, let's get this going. But it takes years when you're trying to go through your whole culture. And I'm not sure. There were a lot of changes happening at GE. The business model was changing, the portfolio. That made it harder. And frankly, I'm not sure, that we could have gotten more traction than we got. So I think that's what you're always working against, is you've got a core business to run. You got to deal with the new things. You're working to make sure enough people are making it their own. And so if you're a business leader listening today, I think the communication is clear. People have to have real examples they can point to. And the faster you can get examples that are relevant to their business, that they see someone in your business unit, their team doing it. So being very deliberate in planting those early adopters are critical. I find the people who are often the ones who maybe are the most critical in your organization. I don't mean the naysayers, but they're good critics. And to find that they've adopted this, that speaks volumes. So be very thoughtful in kind of how you're seeding it and who and what the examples are, because that breeds success. And then you make heroes out of the examples. Customers get excited. You tell stories about that. So all that has to come into bear. It's a bit of a campaign that you're driving in your organization, but always with the examples. And I'd say for us, one of the things to underscore is the feedback mechanism. People had to see it was real. And so one of the things we did culturally is we said, we're going to create more rapid feedback where anyone in the company can give anyone feedback about anything. This is going well, this isn't. So people had to see this was real. And it got to the point that at that time, GE got rid of annual performance reviews. in favor of ongoing feedback. So that spoke volumes. Okay, this feedback, speed to feedback and acting on feedback faster. We're doing that in every part of the company. This is real. So you need a few things like that people can say, they're not just talking about this, they're actually doing it.
Yeah. And I guess that can be difficult for a lot of people, though, the constant feedback or the quote unquote radical transparency, if you will, where you can give people feedback about anything. I imagine it was probably not something that people took to from day one.
Well, again, it had to be seeded. It had to be tested. You needed a few kind of power users, if you will, who show people how to make it work. But what it illustrated for me, what we did is a lot of teams focused on the tool. Like, could you make the tool mobile? Can you get it in everyone's hands? And that's part of it. But how do you give feedback? You don't just like, hey, Steve, that great job. Or you're not going to just text someone, hey, Steve, like that speech wasn't so good. You talk too fast. You need more context behind that. But it would start there. And suddenly, if I gave you that feedback, you and I were now accountable. If you got up and gave a speech and I was in the room, you'd be thinking, Beth's watching me. Mm-hmm. She's seeing if I'm going to be as fast. And hopefully it started a discussion. I don't understand that. Can you give me feedback? Can you help me get better? So it then, I think, brought the need for more coaching, more discussion. It couldn't just be it couldn't just be simple. You needed to dig in a little bit more, and people need to be trained differently and thought about how you manage. I mean, it led me to this belief that kind of management is dead, in the sense that few of us really manage people. We hopefully coach them, we motivate them, we fight to get resources. We all have business deliverables that we have, but no one ever taught me and most of us how to give good feedback. Yeah. But it's essential. So those were the things we had to figure out how to do.
Yeah, and I guess giving good feedback requires a certain level of self-awareness and emotional intelligence as well. And as well as receiving feedback, not to see it as a personal attack, but to see it as an opportunity to improve.
Absolutely. I remember I was up for a chief marketing officer, and I had this big 360 review, and G did it very thoughtfully, interviewed like 15, 30 people in the company, and the feedback came back. And it really startled me. I mean, I got some nice things, but then the kind of what you got to focus on was my colleagues saying, you work so hard to deliver the perfect idea, and you never consult us, and we feel undervalued, and we sometimes don't like working with you. And I had to really stop and go, whoa, like this potentially is going to derail me. I've got to address it. So I was working with an HR person who said, okay, you need to go into the team and you need to tell them you've heard them, you accept them, and you need your help. It was probably one of the hardest conversations I had to do, but I did it. And it totally changed the dynamic. I did need their help. I did need to get better. And it totally kind of opened my perspective on a lot of things, asking for help, not needing to have the answer for an idea, that the seed of an idea is good enough. Other people need to be included. All of those things came out of that. But there are also times when you get feedback that may not jive with your strategy or exactly what you're trying to do. And I think that's to your point about the self-awareness or knowing your strategic intent. You need to be able to say that information is potentially going to derail me if I don't change it, or that's interesting, but it's less relevant to what I'm trying to accomplish now. And then communicate that back again with kind of some self-awareness and ability to be clear on the communications.
Yeah. Could not agree more. And I mean, that not only applies in our professional lives, but in our personal lives too. If someone is in a relationship and they're not happy with their partner, rather than letting that linger and let that resentment build over the course of years, leading to all sorts of questionable behaviors, have the conversation. I mean, it applies in business and it applies in our day-to-day lives as well. Yeah,
absolutely. And again, most of us aren't comfortable with feedback. I remember I learned from my HR colleagues, many people have heard of the feedback sandwich, where you tell someone something positive, something negative, something positive. Yeah,
we call that the shit sandwich. Yeah.
Okay. Good old Aussie. But tell it like it is. But Like I don't know. I feel like that's kind of sugarcoating it. Sometimes you're trying to be helpful. You're trying to say this is an issue, and you're doing it with a good intent. So I think everyone needs to kind of practice what works for them. But the issue is here's something that we need to discuss. Often people need time to hear it. They need to hear it again and again in many cases when you're driving change. And that takes practice.
Mm-hmm. It definitely does. It definitely does. So I wanted to circle back, Beth, to something you said about working with legal compliance and NDAs and things of that persuasion. With respect to changing policies, now I would think that it would make sense that if I have a team who's working on, say, minimum viable products, that you'd create an alternate set of policies or procedures that they can complete to explore rapid experimentation. But the core business would still default to, say, your larger NDA, for example. Is that the way GE approached it?
No.
No? Okay.
I believe in that for certainly kind of budgeting and some of the supply chain, that notion of a core and like sort of a core and a new lane, if you will, two tracks in terms of innovation. But in terms of lean startup, I think there are always areas that need improvement in core business operations. It's not just for something new. And we tried that a lot in IT implementation. Does it have to be perfect? Does every division, every unit have to have it at exact the same time? Is there an off-the-shelf method we can do to test it just to see if the idea is right before you go and build the whole thing? So IT ended up being a big area in the core part of the business, where minimally viable product approach and lean startup worked incredibly well. You needed things done faster. Customers needed answers faster. That works in the core. It doesn't just work on new things.
Yeah. And with respect to IT, I mean, one challenge that I see a lot of companies coming up against is IT pushing back because they don't want to host experiments, say, on the core servers, whether it's HR servers, financial servers, but instead, many of them are looking to just run these experiments, say, in the cloud on Amazon Web Services or something like that. Is that something that came up at GE?
Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely. And that's the beauty of something like AWS or using someone else's backend or app to start with, is that you don't need doesn't cost as much. You can test and learn, and then you can decide, do we need to build this ourselves now that we know this is what's going to work? Or is there a way we can add our own special implementation and get the best of both worlds? So really you're proving the viability of the use case, and then how best to build it flows out of that is what we learned. Yeah,
makes sense. So, I mean, there was a hell of a lot of success stories that came out of GE's exploration of the Lean Startup philosophy and the FastWorks program. But as our listeners will know, about a year and a half ago, there was a bit of an executive shakeup. CEO Jeff Immelt was forced, essentially, resigned, and that shakeup included yourself. This was on the back of some activist investor moves. I mean, what did you put this down to?
Well, I put it down to a lot of change was happening. New team, time for a new team. I knew I would probably be leaving GE at some point within, Jeff was coming to the end of his tenure. It was certainly more abrupt than I expected. It made it difficult to being so abrupt. John Flannery came in as the new CEO, and he wanted a new team. And I think that often happens. So it was abrupt. I think, look, there was a lot of change happening at GE in the aftermath of the decision to get out of GE Capital, to simplify the business, to be much more focused on industrial technology. And I think a lot of people underestimated the complexity that was GE, both inside and out. And so you've seen GE in the past year and a half try to work through that. It's about being simpler, faster, all those things they're working through. It's complicated and it's complex. Yeah.
We're seeing the selling off of a lot of divisions and business units and things of that persuasion at the moment. So On that, I guess one thing that a lot of companies will struggle with, especially listed organizations, is the short-termism of shareholders. And, they want their dividend, and they may not really understand this lean startup stuff, because not only do you need to get buy-in from people within the organization, but you need to convince shareholders that what you're working on is the right thing. Otherwise, we can see them pushing back and not believing in the company, and the share price dwindling. And I know at the time of the executive shakeup, GE's share price was down about 20%. So, how do we, I know it's not an easy question to answer, and perhaps there is no immediate answer for it, but what do we need to consider perhaps when we're trying to navigate, hey, we want to plan for the future, but we've also got these short-term demands of our shareholders to be cognizant of?
Yeah, look, I think it's what often happens is we blame quarterly earnings or shareholders for kind of a lack of courage for investing in the future. Mm-hmm. And yes, there is short-termism, and it is a problem. So I'm not suggesting that. I came to see this work. Mm-hmm. I espouse to what we mentioned earlier, this idea of almost like a two-speed way of operating your company. You've got sort of your core business, and then you're kind of making room for what's new and what's next. There's sort of a classic 3-box theory out of business school. Box 1's your core, about 70% of your resources, people, time. Box 2 is adjacent, about 15% of that. It's a little longer time horizon. Box 3, or kind of lane 2 or 3, is what's new, and it's a longer horizon. You're not even sure if you have a product or a customer. Companies have to optimize today, and you have to plant the seeds for tomorrow. Yeah. And they require different investments, levels, different kinds of people to run the next and new versus the core, different expectations of profitability. And I think we get confused about that. And I think we're afraid to share that with investors often, or if investors question it, we think that means we shouldn't be doing it. There are ways to measure what's new and next. How many ideas are you testing? How long is it going to take you to get from kind of a minimally viable to a viable product? How are you going to go from one customer to many? Many things you got to work through before you ever figure out if it's profitable, but you're looking for traction, you're looking for growth, and then you're looking for scale. And I think that's good leadership. And so any leader who's listening, I don't care if you're leading a company or a team, you can carve space, time, budget out to experiment, to figure out what's coming new and next. I'm trying to make the case with the book. Tomorrow always comes, and you better be ready for it. Mm-hmm. And it's about good leadership. And so, yes, investors, they may not like some of the capital allocation, but are you being transparent enough with them? Mm-hmm. At the end of the day, who's running the company? And so I think it's back to leadership. I think it's good leaders are able to say, I'm optimizing today. I can give you a model built on some reliability, and I'm also building the new. It's less known. We're figuring it out. We'll be as transparent with what we learn when we learn it.
Yeah. And you could point to a company like an Amazon who has been able to sell a story and a vision and has this leadership that inspires confidence in investors. And for so long, they were basically recording a loss year after year after year, but investors believed. So it is about selling that story as well and being a little bit more transparent with investors.
Yeah, and I think investors too. I'm always shocked at investors who are surprised by change that's happening in an industry. Look at Apple, and people questioning, is the iPhone too expensive? Well, if you're an investor, again, imagine forward. Start to ask those questions. What is Apple doing for different price points of phones? These are things informed investors and should be asking. I often wonder, where are the activist investors for the future? Where are the people who are asking, what are you doing to make sure you're going to be here 50 years from now? Here's an interesting statistic. 50 years ago, the life expectancy of a Fortune 500 company was 75 years. Today, it's 15. Yep. Facebook just celebrated its 15th birthday. So I think you want to be asking these questions, and you want to ask them before it's an emergency.
Yeah, and to build on that stat, I think that might that comes out of the Insight report, which also finds that about 50% of the S&P 500 will be replaced in the next 10 years or so, at current rates of churn. So something to be wary of. And something you touched on, which I think is worth just double clicking on, is the metrics you use to measure early stage innovation are going to be different from the metrics you use to measure later stage innovation, such as your ROI and your internal rate of return. I mean, initially you want to have leading indicators, and those leading indicators will inform where you place subsequent bets in. So rather than just one big bet like we alluded to earlier, where organizations can add a lot of complexity and time and cost to projects that ultimately go nowhere. So we're much better off placing lots of small bets rather than one big one, to help us identify where we should actually invest a little bit more.
Exactly. And I got accused often of being the dabbler, the one dabbling in these little bets. But, you're doing it against a thesis. So, we believe in renewable energy. We're, quote, dabbling in the sense of we're testing wind versus solar versus storage. And when we find what works, we'll invest in and scale up in that area. So you still have a core strategy of renewable energy. It's just the way you may go there comes out of a lot of these little bets. And I think people get confused about that. They think it's, you're doing too much. But if it's against a good thesis and a good strategy of where you see the future going, you need to be judged on how many things have you tested before you got to what worked. Because otherwise, how confident am I that this is what's going to work for you?
Yeah, it's not enough to just say, I just know.
Yeah, I know. And that's what companies do.
Yeah.
And I think startups do that quite a bit because they have disruptors. And again, if I were running a small company, a startup company, I would be even more panicked about being caught off guard. Because what happens is you start to think, well, I'm faster than the big guy. And that's all that matters. And you're not looking that somebody may be even faster than you.
Yeah, couldn't agree more. And one thing on the three buckets, so Horizon 1, Horizon 2, and Horizon 3, when it comes to that Horizon 3 disruptive innovation, did GE have a lot of people working on that in terms of the percentage of the organization? Because I would imagine it would be a very small percentage that would work on that blue sky stuff.
No, we didn't have a lot. I mean, I think we could have used more. We had our R&D center, our research and development. So they were looking at technological breakthroughs. And then we created our ventures arm as a business model R&D. So we were looking at new revenue models, new partnership models, the things that weren't core technology dependent. And bringing in a lot of partners, bringing in entrepreneurs who we wanted to seed businesses like an inspection by drone business, and having to look at different ownership stakes, incentive payment schemes. Not everybody has to be a full-time employee or paid exactly the same way. Can you incent people on the upside? Now, there are different people who are capable of doing that and who want to do that. So not everybody in the organization wants to take on those roles or has the skills to do that. But I think there are a lot more in our companies than we think. We tend to think dismissively, oh, that's too far off. Oh, you're not making a profit. Yeah, we tend to dismiss those people when they play an equally important role in the company.
Yeah. And I guess sometimes we might dismiss people based on preconceived notions about them and their tenure in the company and the positions they've held. But if you put them in a different position, they might actually, throw them in the deep end. They might actually learn to swim. But on tenures, oftentimes people will say innovation and thinking creatively is about collecting a lot of dots and then connecting them later. Or so was the old adage by Steve Jobs. Now, I mean, you were at GE for 27 years, which is a very long tenure by today's standards, but you were spearheading innovation.
By anybody's standards.
By anybody's standards. I mean, how do you reconcile such a long tenure with creativity and innovation? Because most people will think, oh, she was at GE for 27 years, surely she's not creative. But everything I know about you suggests the total opposite.
And I worked in media for a big part of that too, for about half of that time. And I found the industrial side incredible for creativity, and maybe even more so, which people often find surprising too. what I liked about a company like GE is because we were in different industries. We were in healthcare, in energy, in transportation. You could start to see those patterns, start to see where things were alike. For example, the digitization of industry. We saw that coming out of the media world with the arrival of YouTube and the disruption that digital was bringing to media. And you start to see it coming to energy and then to healthcare. So when you have kind of I had a position of sort of being able to look horizontally. And I think more organizations need people like that to be able to sort of connect those dots. And so there was always something new, a new part of the world, a new part of a business to explore. I was not a deep expert in any one industry. My expertise was going and connecting those dots. And there was just always some new dots to connect.
Yeah.
You never run out of those.
Yeah. And I think GE is definitely a unique organization in that respect, where you could work and think horizontally because there was just so many different things going on. I mean, it's essentially a conglomerate versus being in a company whereby you might have a very, very narrow lane to play in.
Yeah, but I think I'm on the board of Nike, and I have been exposed to a number of different companies. I think every company serves different. Many companies, not every, many companies serve different markets, different customer bases, different use cases. All of those are ripe ways to connect the dots in different ways. So I bet I'm kind of would be curious to think of a business that you couldn't have a horizontal perspective.
Yeah. Fair enough. Well, thank you so much, Beth. This has been very enlightening. I'm sure it has been for our audience. But before we go, we've got to jump into our 3-question lightning round. And as someone who spent 27 years at GE, if you could work for any other organization at any stage of the company lifecycle, who would it be and why?
That's a good one. That's a good one. Well, boy, I'm so, I mean, as I said earlier, I've had a chance to get to know Nike by being on their board. I love the company. It's a really great company. That's one. Maybe that's not a fair answer. I'm always passionate about startups. So I think there is probably a clean energy startup being formed somewhere that I'd get excited about. I'm not answering you very well right now, but I have to think about that one a bit.
No problem. We'll just take Nike for now. Question number 2 is probably a little bit trickier, and it is, if you could ask anyone a question, dead or alive, who would it be and what would you ask?
Well, no, a business question, you mean, right? Oh,
it could be anyone.
Okay. Well, I am really intrigued these days about quantum physics, and I would ask Albert Einstein to explain physics to me, and kind of give me his view of how he was inspired. I know he actually questioned some of the quantum physics thinking, but I would ask him about the creativity of a math mind, of a physicist, and where his creativity came from, and was he inspired? Was it? I just would love to know the creativity that came from his mind, and I've been really intrigued lately about math as a creative endeavor, which is something I would not have thought about a few years ago.
How did you come upon your sudden interest in math?
Well, I've actually been taking a philosophy class, and we've been looking a lot at reason versus at sort of logic versus emotion.
Right.
And I've just been thinking a lot, and I've just been reading a lot about mathematicians and the sort of beauty they see in their mathematic equations. And I have been my career's been about human behavior and emotion and nature. So it's very foreign to me, but I'm intrigued that we have a commonality and sort of there's a beauty overlap in creativity.
Yeah, whenever someone talks about reason versus emotion, I can't help but refer to Pericles, the ancient Greek statesman who was all about reason rather than letting emotion dictate big strategic decisions like going to war and things of that nature. Lucky last, Beth, rituals or routines? What do you do to stay on top of your game on a daily basis?
Yeah, well, I'm big on working out. I'm big on yoga and kind of walking. If you see me in Manhattan walking all of Manhattan, you'll know that's some crazy person out walking all the time. That's me.
Mm-hmm.
But I'm one of my regular practices and rituals that I write about and is make room for discovery. I'm constantly out discovering, trying to see if I can find something new. What's next? It could be a pop-up retail concept down the street. It could be taking a different route that I'm walking to a meeting. Just constantly looking for kind of new trends and patterns. And I try to make that part of the every day. Read something new, go out and discover something new.
Yeah, and I think that's a critical point. You don't create just by sitting there and willing your brain to be creative. You've got to get out there and walk around and create that mental space for ideas to come to you and to observe things in the world.
Absolutely.
Well, Beth, this has been an absolute pleasure, and our audience can pick up a copy of Imagine It Forward on Amazon and wherever good books are sold. They can hit you up on Twitter at Beth Comstock and visit you online at bethcomstock.info. Is there anything else we should share with our audience?
No, you've got it. Thanks, Steve. Thanks for the opportunity.
No worries. It's been a pleasure. Hope you enjoy the rest of your day.
I will. Thank you. So long.
Hi guys, Steve again. I hope you enjoyed this episode. If you'd like to receive a weekly email from me, complete with reflections, books I've been reading, words of wisdom, and access to blogs, ebooks, and more that I'm publishing on a regular basis, just leave your details at futuresquared.xyz/subscribe and you'll receive the very next one. If you're picking up what I'm putting down, take a minute to like, share, or subscribe on Apple Podcasts, Google Play, Spotify, or wherever you get your podcasts. It goes a long way to giving the podcast the exposure it needs so I can continue bringing you guests and conversations of the highest caliber. You can catch me on Twitter at Steve Glibeski and on Instagram at TheSteveGlibeski. Until next time.
Hasta la vista, baby.